Hello watch enthusiasts and welcome to Watch Chronicler Podcast. In this 6th episode of this weekly podcast, I'd like to speak about a watch which is possibly the most important luxury watch of all time, in terms of its contribution and in terms of its heritage through history. And it is a Patek Philippe, and it's the Patek Philippe Calatrava, which is essentially their base dress watch, if ever such thing existed, for such an expensive and luxurious brand. But it's not of luxury or exclusivity that I'd like to speak today. Because, more importantly, the Calatrava has changed the way we look at watches. It preceded some of the most important stylistic changes in watches of the 20th century, and has formed what we expect to see in a wristwatch when we put it on our wrist or we look at it in a shop window. And so today I'd like to tell a tale of 3 generations of Patek Philippe Calatrava, looking from the 1930s when this was a forward-looking watch, to the 1970s when it realised that it had to look back in order to remain valuable, and indeed important at a time of changing aesthetics and changing approaches to watches. Before I begin the podcast though, remember to like, share and subscribe if you're listening to this podcast on YouTube, and do remember to go over to Spotify or SoundCloud if you find that more convenient, to allow you to be able to turn the screen off and simply put your phone in your pocket or put your phone down and still have the audio of this particular podcast. Also, for more, do head over to watchchronicler.com to be able to see full articles and new features about new releases, particular product reviews, or more considered articles about the history of watches, or simply other aspects of this particular industry. For example, yesterday I released an article about the new Omega Speedmaster, which certainly is starting to turn heads. The story of this watch begins long before its inception, in fact, at the turn of the 20th century. At this point, Patek Philippe had a pretty roaring trade in terms of sales in Europe, to the luxury market within Europe, but also to South America, which was a significant market actually, with some specific sellers having their own movements being made by Patek for them, out of gold, which isn't the standard material for a movement. So it had a significant sort of market share in those particular areas, and was able to do significant trade, but after the First World War it became more reliant on the American market, as these other markets began to suffer, or struggled with financial problems after the strain of war. Of course, this esteemed brand did still have some sales in Europe, in areas such as Germany during the Stresemann years, when there was some money circulating, and there was a certain level of prosperity. However, this really wasn't the ideal time to sell in Europe, and so reliance upon the US was clear, but come the Wall Street crash at the end of the 1920s, Patek had nowhere to go in terms of selling its elaborate, complicated and expensive watches. And so by the early 30s, Patek Philippe was suffering from a difficult period. They didn't have the best of sales, and debt was starting to pile up. And so they really were in need of new guidance, especially in a world where the style of sales had changed. Selling one-off pieces really wasn't the main business anymore. This was demonstrated by Rolex with watches like the Oyster, for example, where these big names became recognisable and much easier to buy than having to specify the shape of the watch case you wanted or the particular movement and mechanisms within it. So Patek Philippe was in need of new leadership and new direction. So come 1931, a new family was at the helm of Patek Philippe, and this was the Stern family. And they're still in fact at the helm of the company today, showing the length of time during which this family has been able to work wonders really with this brand, in terms of creating a unique approach to the industry. But the background of this family was in dial manufacturing. So they had worked in the watch industry, but they hadn't worked in this particular way running a full brand. And it took them a few years to get the brand into shape. But come 1932 they had a whole new model, and this was the Calatrava, the first serially produced Patek Philippe. In truth, the very creation of this watch in 1932 represented just what the Stern family wanted, which was to bring a new sort of page, a new time to this brand. And so they selected the Calatrava name, and Calatrava is a name which is really integral to the brand of Patek Philippe, because the Calatrava cross is the logo. And the Calatrava cross was a 12th century symbol created for a set of knights of a military order during the Crusades. But its connection to Patek Philippe had endured for quite some years by that stage, so naming a watch after the very emblem of the brand showed the importance of it to the brand as a whole. And so the first Calatrava, released in 1932, was the reference 96. And the 96 was a small watch, being 31mm in diameter by 9mm thick. But it was a watch which nonetheless reshaped Patek, because it was a very simple watch, just 3 hands, originally with a JLC caliber inside it, a manually wound movement, but by 1934 Patek were offering their own in-house 12-120 movement, which was similar in terms of what it offered, as a manually wound, very, very high quality movement. But it fitted into this simple concept of not having a complicated calendar on the watch or anything of that nature. Being serially produced and having a particular name meant that people could simply go into a shop and ask for a Calatrava, which simplified things and was very much in line with modern marketing. But to continue in these sorts of lines, Patek also changed the design of the watch, because this watch had integrated lugs, so the lugs weren't welded to the case, as was the general convention with a lot of watches earlier than this, having cases which still shared quite a lot with pocket watches in terms of design. But here it had the lugs integrated into the case, and so this watch was designed as a wristwatch first and foremost, with no vestige of pocket watch sort of design still in it, even if you can see some of these aspects still in the movement. Of course, looking at this watch analytically does sometimes remove one from simply looking at it and saying it's a beautiful watch, which I think undoubtedly this watch is. It's a very simple design, a classic design of course by modern standards, but a stunning one nonetheless. It also played into the period's thoughts, I think, especially amongst the wealthy, because this watch played into the concepts which were brought up by the Bauhaus school, and I won't dwell on this too much because I think the Bauhaus is vastly over-discussed in the watch industry. But here you really do have a watch which was directly influenced, because between 1919 and the early 30s, when it was eventually closed, the Bauhaus school, especially in its design sections, focused on creating products which were mass-produced, or could be mass-produced, and that were elegant and functional for daily life, and that's exactly what the Calatrava is. The fact that it's a luxury watch is somewhat irrelevant at this point, because it was simply an extremely good quality, superlative watch. The quality of every component would be phenomenal, but it was nonetheless a watch which was simple and did the job, and this manifested itself even further in later years, as some steel variants of the 96 began to be produced, albeit in smaller numbers than the gold versions, which were the most popular. But by the outbreak of the Second World War, it was clear that this tactic was working, because by 1936 a profit was being made by Patek Philippe, and indeed by 1939 they had 10 new movements in production, produced in-house by this brand. A year prior, though, Patek introduced two important models to the range, the reference 570 and the reference 565. The 570 is usually the more popular of the two, and it had a very similar design to the 96. In fact, both of these models shared a design with the 96 where the dial was concerned, but the 570 shared its case as well, except grew to 35.5mm from the rather diminutive 31mm of the 96, and retained the same flat bezel and same style, and really was a beautiful watch with the same small seconds too. The 565, though, took a new sort of spin and approach to the Calatrava. This was the first serially produced steel model of the Calatrava, and had a stronger case with thicker lugs and a sloping bezel rather than the separate flat bezels seen on earlier models. It also launched with the same size as the 570, that's to say 35.5mm, and perhaps most importantly, it had screw-on caseback rather than the pop-on caseback, which allowed it to have a certain water resistance. And this showed that the Calatrava was quite a wonderful watch in terms of balancing practicality and everyday use with the luxury quality of Patek Philippe. But at the core of this family remained the reference 96, which had an incredibly long span of production, bearing in mind that it was released in 1932 and eventually is continued in the early 70s. So it was a watch which, despite its small size, retained a certain relevance for an extended period of time. Certainly the quality of this brand and the quality of the products changed and varied somewhat over the years, I mean in terms of the features included and the details, but the standards remained the same. Of course, endless different dial variations were produced during this period. As you can imagine, during 40 years of production there would be such change, but there was everything from rather collectible Arabic numerals painted on in the Breguet style, with Breguet hands on these watches, to Dauphine hands and baton markers, and everything you can imagine in between. In fact, there are even some versions which were produced with more modern dials, if you will, in the sense they were more sporty, with luminous syringe-style hands and luminous markers, with central seconds too, by having an indirect second complication. And whilst the references 570 and 565 have appreciated very significantly and very steeply in recent years, the 96 has still remained relatively accessible. Of course, it'll still cost the price of an entry-level Rolex if you buy it brand new, but I think that for what you're getting an enormous amount of watch, albeit in a very small package, because the vast majority of people simply won't wear a 31mm watch, because it goes down to such a small size that you really have to be an enthusiast or someone who actively enjoys very small watches to be able to enjoy wearing one of these. But even so, for the historical value and the sheer beauty of one of these watches, I'd certainly be happy to pay the price. The next stage of the Calatrava came in 1953, and this was the release of two new models, the 2526 and the 2552. And these echoed the style of the 96 where the dial was concerned, but the 50s was seen very acutely in the cases, with exquisite new crowns with a reversed Patek Philippe style logo, as well as a new movement. To the best of my knowledge, it's not known which of these two watches was released first, but starting with the 2552, this is the generally less well known of the two. This had a rounded flying saucer or disco volante style of case, with a beautiful double-step bezel and straight sort of pointed lugs, which extended from the circular form of the case, and I think this is a beautiful and extremely elegant dress watch. By comparison, the 2526 was more radical. This was really an iconic design which changed Patek Philippe in terms of their later versions of the Calatrava. It had curved but heavily thickened lugs, a convex or domed style of bezel, which served to give more curves than the original 30s design, which was much sharper. These watches also grew to 36mm in diameter, and had the most exquisite of dials, where some bejewelled dials were available, but perhaps more interesting were the standard ones with baton-style markers, because these had double-baked enamel dials which gave a wonderful sort of surface and a creaminess which wouldn't be seen elsewhere. These weren't produced in steel, but were produced in all three tones of gold and platinum. What's most important about this watch is that if you put it next to, let's say, a Rolex from 1953 or an Omega, those watches look somewhat dated, whereas this watch still looks absolutely contemporary, which is just a demonstration of just how brilliant a design this was, and the reason why now when we think of a dress watch, we think of a relatively slender watch with three hands, usually a light dial with baton markers, and an automatic movement. And it's the automatic winding which shows a new stage for these watches, because both the 2552 and 2526 had automatic winding, courtesy of the caliber 12600 AT. This was Patek's first automatic movement, and a gold standard for many in terms of quality and design. Certainly it still had old-fashioned components, such as, for example, quarter plates and cocks, which were independent within the movement, rather than having the modern styles of bridges and plates, which we so often see. But make no mistake, these were modern movements in terms of having Patek Philippe's proprietary Gyromax balance wheel, which was seen on all but the very earliest of these movements, and also they did have a large 18-karat yellow-gold rotor to wind the watch. Now these rotors did cause some wear to their bearings as a result of their sheer weight, but generally the design was extremely sound and very, very functional, making this watch, which beat at 19,800 vibrations per hour, a fantastic movement to be placed within these watches, and is still regarded by many as a sublime example of good watchmaking creating an automatic movement. And aside from the title of having the first decorated rotor for an automatic watch, these pieces were important in terms of changing what the Calatrava stood for. The original Calatravas released in the 30s were a new take on the dress watch, or in fact created to a certain extent the dress watch which we expected by that point. By 1953 though, these watches changed to a genre which was very, very accepted. Offices across the world saw watches of this nature being worn, but these added a level of everyday practicality. These were no longer watches for exclusive formal occasions, they were watches to be worn every day, and so water resistance was standard, as well as automatic winding to keep the watch going, as well as sheer simplicity and elegance, which fitted with that time, and still is appropriate today because it was a design which hasn't appeared dated, or too rooted in its period. Instead it's a universal design which just is extremely elegant. But the final stage of the Calatrava which I'd like to speak about was the third generation in the early 70s. And so by this point the last of the very early generations with the 96 had died out, so to speak, or had been discontinued after a very, very long period of production. And so Patek found themselves with a new period to deal with, a very different time, one in which the Calatrava really was a staple of the dress watch world. But of course the whole watch industry changed in the 70s, and even by the early 70s Patek needs to reinvent the design to fit with this period. And where previous watches had looked forwards, this watch looked somewhat backwards and was the reference 3520. Of course the 70s were a period when Patek Philippe realised, alongside other brands like Audemars Piguet, that a new design was needed, and just as the Nautilus was produced to cater to this new market for a steel sports watch, and it must be said wasn't as spectacularly successful as you might believe it to be today, the watch which remained very much the bread and butter of the dress watch section within Patek Philippe's range was the Calatrava. And so this 1973 release of the 3520 gave a new design. Where previous watches had been very, very shapely and very curved, this new watch was much tighter, much more angular, much sharper, and much more befitting an enjoyment of gold, lustrous sort of appearances. Even certain traditional elements which simply wouldn't have fitted with earlier models were now present, as Patek Philippe were looking back in terms of their design towards something more traditionally acceptable. The bezel, for example, was flat in a similar way to the 1930s models, but where those had been flat in their entirety, this was covered with a hobnail or clou de Paris pattern, and this created a more complex appearance, and one which really did demonstrate the lustre of the gold which this watch is so often seen in. Equipped with an ultra-slim caliber 177 manually wound movement, which was similar to the 175 but with an increased beat rate of 21,600 vibrations per hour, the dial of this watch didn't actually display the seconds, but had Roman numerals instead of Arabic numerals or batons, again bringing in that sort of old-fashioned or traditional aesthetic this watch has, which was ahead of its time, especially with the golden elements, which fitted very well with the 80s and the 90s, making this a particularly popular watch for the next 20 or so years. But all three of these designs, whether you look at the 30s models, the 50s models, or the 70s models, still can be seen in today's Patek Philippe collection, and this ranges from seeing a virtual remake of the reference 96 with the 5196 currently seen in their range, to certain components, certain elements which have been echoed in their modern models. And so I hope this video has conveyed just what an important watch the Calatrava was, both for the brand in terms of realigning Patek Philippe with the world of the watch industry, but also as a model for watches which we expect to see today, whether it's the most formal of dress watches you're looking at, or something far more everyday. There's a good chance the Calatrava was an influence, certainly an inspiration, in terms of the way that design came together. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this podcast about this particular aspect of the watch industry, but do head over to our YouTube channel's website or Spotify to be able to hear new podcasts, see new videos, and read new articles from Watch Chronicler. So thank you very much for listening. This is Armand from WatchChronicler.com. Out.